Every Western fan thinks they know Tombstone inside and out. They can recite Doc Holliday's needling one-liners in their sleep. They know every strut, every squint, every gunshot in the OK Corral sequence by heart. But there is one thread running through this movie that almost nobody outside the cast ever noticed, and it has to do with the quietest, steadiest performance in the entire film, Sam Elliott's Virgil Earp. Elliot has spent years dropping small, scattered comments in interviews about what actually happened behind the scenes. And once you line those comments up, they paint a picture of a movie that very nearly wasn't the movie we know at all. Stick around, because by the end of this you'll understand why Elliot has always talked about Tombstone with a strange mix of pride and quiet frustration. Let's set the stage first. Tombstone hit theaters in December of 1993, and on paper it should never have worked. It was a mid-budget Western in an era when Westerns were considered box office poison. It went through a director change in the middle of production, and it was racing against a rival Wyatt Earp movie from a major studio. And yet, it became one of the most quoted, most rewatched films of its generation, a movie that men in bars still recite from memory 30 years later. Kurt Russell anchored it as Wyatt Earp, all clenched jaw and controlled fury. Val Kilmer turned Doc Holliday into a legend, a dying gambler who somehow made tuberculosis look like the coolest disease in the world. Bill Paxton gave Morgan Earp a boyish warmth that made his death hit harder than it had any right to. Powers Booth brought a lazy, dangerous menace to Curly Bill. And running underneath all of it, holding the whole family together, was Sam Elliott's Virgil, the older brother, the lawman with the mustache like a landslide, the one who tried to keep the peace right up until the moment peace stopped being an option. Elliott's Virgil doesn't get the flashy lines. He doesn't get the Huckleberry moment or the "I'm your Daisy" swagger. What he gets is presence. The sense that this is a man who has already seen enough gunfights to know exactly how bad this one is going to get. And according to Elliot himself, that quiet weight wasn't entirely a performance choice. It came out of just how much material about Virgil never made it to the screen. Here's the part fans tend to miss entirely. The version of Tombstone playing in theaters was a heavily trimmed version of a much longer script. Kevin Jarre, the writer who was originally supposed to direct the film, had put together a script that ran well past 3 hours in its earliest form, and that script gave the Earp family, all of them, not just Wyatt, a much deeper history. Virgil in particular had scenes that filled in his backstory as a lawman before Tombstone, his marriage, and the reasoning behind why he, more than Wyatt, was the one pushing so hard for the town's gun ordinance. Elliot has said in more than one interview over the years that reading that original script was part of why he signed on to the project in the first place. He responded to the density of it, the sense that every brother had his own arc and his own reason for being in that town. Then the production fell apart. Jarre, who had never directed a feature film before, struggled badly once cameras started rolling. He was behind schedule, unable to get the coverage the studio needed, and roughly a month into filming, he was removed from the director's chair and replaced by George P. Cosmatos. What happened next is where Elliot's frustration really starts, because Cosmatos didn't just take over directing duties. He took a chainsaw to Jarre's script. Nearly 30 pages were cut, and the trims fell heaviest on exactly the kind of connected material Elliot had responded to. Subplots dealing with the extended Earp family, quieter character beats, and a good chunk of what made Virgil a fully rounded man on the page instead of just the responsible one, all ended up on the cutting room floor before a single new scene was even shot. Elliot has been fairly candid that he wasn't thrilled about this. He's called the original script one of the best he'd ever read, and he said that if the trim version had been the one handed to him at the audition stage, he isn't sure he would have taken the role at all. That's a striking admission from an actor who ended up delivering one of the most respected performances in the film. It means the Virgil Earp audiences fell in love with stoic, dignified, a man of few words, was partly born out an actor working with less material than he'd signed up for and choosing to communicate everything that got cut through posture, silence, and that unmistakable voice instead. What almost nobody realized at the time was who was actually making these cutting decisions on set day to day. Cosmatos had the title of director, but the man quietly running the production behind the scenes was Kurt Russell. Russell has since confirmed this himself, describing how Cosmatos was effectively brought in as what he called a shepherding presence, someone experienced enough to satisfy the studio and keep the production insured, while Russell handled blocking, pacing, and how scenes were actually built on the day. Russell kept this arrangement quiet for years, reportedly out of respect for Cosmatos, and didn't discuss it openly until after Cosmatos had passed away. Val Kilmer has backed up parts of this account, though he stopped short of saying Russell directed every actor personally. Some cast members, including Michael Biehn, have said Russell never gave them direct notes at all. Still, the through line is clear enough. Russell was the one steering the emotional center of the film, particularly the relationship between Wyatt and Doc, and that meant Russell was also one of the people deciding what got trimmed from Jar's sprawling draft. This is exactly where Elliot's discomfort and Russell's vision collide. Russell has talked about wanting to sharpen the film around one relationship above all others, the bond between Wyatt and Doc, which he's described as one of the great unspoken love stories in American film. Two men who would die for each other without ever needing to say so out loud. To get there, Russell needed a leaner film, and a leaner film meant less room for every other Earp brother's inner life. Elliot's Virgil absorbed a lot of that cost. He went from a character with a fleshed-out past to a character defined almost entirely by his actions in the present tense. The shotgun blast that cost him the use of his arm, the calm refusal to back down from the cowboys even after he's already been warned, the brief, wordless exchange with Wyatt in the aftermath. Elliot made it work, and made it work so well that most audiences never clocked that they were watching a character running on a fraction of his intended material. But Elliot clocked it. He's the one who had to build a full performance out of what was left. There's a second layer to Elliot's frustration that fans rarely connect to the first, and it involves the film's approach to historical accuracy. Cosmatos, once he took over, leaned hard into period detail. Costumes, props, and mannerisms were all researched to an almost obsessive degree. The cast was famously required to grow real mustaches rather than wear fake ones, with only actor John Tenney unable to grow his in time, leaving him to wear a prosthetic and reportedly feel like the odd one out on set. That obsession with surface authenticity is part of why Tombstone still looks and feels more convincing than most westerns of its era. But Elliot has pointed out, gently and without ever trashing the finished film, that all the mustache-grade authenticity in the world doesn't replace narrative depth. You can get every button on a costume historically correct and still lose the connective tissue that makes an audience understand why a character makes the choices he makes. For Elliot, the tightened script solved the pacing problem at the cost of a character problem, and Virgil was a character who paid for it most visibly. None of this stopped Elliot from delivering what many critics and fans consider one of the most quietly powerful performances in the film. If anything, knowing the backstory makes a performance land even harder. Watch the scene where Virgil, badly wounded, tells Wyatt he isn't going to be able to keep fighting, and you're watching an actor who has already reckoned with losing most of his character's built-in history, choose and put every ounce of that missing depth into his face and his voice instead of his lines. It's a masterclass in doing more with less, except in this case, less wasn't a stylistic choice Elliot made. It was a constraint the production handed him, and he turned that constraint into one of the most respected supporting performances in the Western genre. Elliot's comments over the years have also touched on something else fans rarely think about: how strange it is to watch a movie knowing what could have been. He's talked about occasionally rewatching Tombstone and finding himself filling in gaps from memory, mentally restoring beats that only ever existed in Jar's original draft. For him, there are essentially two versions of the film living side by side: the one audiences know, tight and propulsive and endlessly quotable, and the fuller, slower version that exists only in his memory of table reads and an early script he still speaks fondly of. That's an unusual position for an actor to be in, carrying around a ghost version of a movie that made him famous. It's worth pointing out that Elliot has never framed any of this as a grudge. He's spoken with real affection about Cosmatos stepping into an impossible situation, about Russell's quiet leadership holding the production together, and about how proud he is of the finished film. His comments read less like complaints and more like an actor being honest about the strange, unglamorous mechanics of how a beloved movie actually gets made, how the version that becomes a classic is often assembled out of compromises nobody in the audience will ever see. That honesty is part of why so many people in the industry respect Elliot as much as they do. He's never tried to inflate his own contribution or tear down anyone else's. He's simply been willing to say, plainly, that the Virgil Earp fans' love was built from less than what was originally written for him. There's a broader lesson buried in Elliot's account that applies to almost any film with a troubled production. The movie audiences eventually watch is rarely the movie that was originally planned. It's a compromise shaped by schedule pressure, budget limits, a change in leadership, and 100 small decisions made under stress that nobody involved fully agreed on at the time. Tombstone is a rare case where that compromise actually worked in the film's favor. The tighter, faster version turned out to be more rewatchable, more quotable, and more commercially successful than the sprawling 3-hour epic jar originally envisioned might have been. But it worked out, and it was easy, are two very different things. And Elliot's account makes clear it wasn't easy, especially for the actors whose characters lost the most material in the process. So the next time you watch Sam Elliott stride into frame as Virgil